My daughter-in-law blocked me on everything without a single word, and 2 weeks later, I was holding a lottery ticket worth $50 million in my shaking hands. But the strangest part wasn't the money. It was how quickly silence turned into interest when people realized I was no longer invisible. I remember the exact moment I found out I'd been cut off, not because anyone told me, but because my messages stopped delivering, my calls went straight to voicemail, and even the photos of my grandchildren disappeared from my screen as if I had never existed in their lives at all. At first, I told myself it was a mistake, maybe a phone glitch, maybe Ashley had changed her settings again. But deep down, there was a quiet voice telling me the truth I didn't want to face, that this wasn't an accident. It was a decision, one made deliberately, cleanly, and without hesitation. I sat in my kitchen that morning, the same kitchen where I had cooked Sunday dinners for over 30 years, staring at my phone like it might suddenly explain everything. But it didn't, and the silence felt louder than any argument we'd ever had. My son, Daniel, hadn't called in weeks, which wasn't unusual anymore, but now I couldn't even reach him if I tried. And that was different, that was final. I didn't cry, not then, not the way people expect you to when your own family shuts you out. Instead, I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and let the realization settle slowly, like dust in a room no one had entered in years. I thought about all the little moments that had led up to this, the missed holidays, the unanswered invitations, the way Ashley would smile politely but keep her distance, as if I were something inconvenient she had to tolerate rather than someone who had once been at the center of everything. And then, just when I had almost convinced myself that this quiet rejection was something I could live with, something small and manageable, life shifted in a way I never could have predicted, and suddenly the same people who had erased me were about to remember my name again. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and I live just outside of Columbus, Ohio. And this is the story of how losing my family showed me exactly who they were, and what happened when I finally had something they couldn't ignore. I had always believed that silence between family members was temporary, something that could be fixed with time, patience, and a little bit of grace, but the kind of silence that followed being cut off like that felt different. It felt permanent, like a door that had been closed not just gently, but locked from the inside. The house became quieter in ways I had never noticed before. The ticking of the clock in the hallway seemed louder, the hum of the refrigerator stretched into the evenings, and even the sound of my own footsteps felt unfamiliar, as if I were walking through someone else's life instead of my own. After my husband passed 3 years ago, I had already grown used to a certain level of loneliness, but this was not the same. This was not absence. This was erasure. I still followed the same routines because routines give structure when everything else falls apart. I woke up at 6, made my coffee, read the local paper, and watered the small garden in the backyard that my husband and I had planted together, but every action carried a quiet awareness that there was no one left who expected anything from me. Daniel used to call at least once a week, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to ask about a recipe Ashley wanted to try, but over time those calls had become shorter, less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether, and I told myself he was busy, that work had picked up, that life simply moved on. I remembered the last Thanksgiving I had spent with them, how Ashley had insisted on hosting, how everything looked perfect on the surface, the table set with matching plates, the food arranged like something out of a magazine. And yet there had been something beneath it all, a distance I could not quite explain at the time. She had smiled, she had been polite, but there was a carefulness in the way she spoke to me, as if every word had been measured, as if she had already decided how much space I was allowed to occupy in their lives. I did not question it then because I did not want to create problems where none had been spoken out loud. But looking back, I could see the pattern forming long before I was willing to admit it. The missed invitations, the changes in plans that I found out about after the fact, the way family photos were taken without me standing just outside the frame, all of it added up slowly, quietly, until one day there was nothing left to hold on to. And still, I never imagined it would end with something as simple and as final as being blocked, because that is not just distance. That is a decision to make sure you cannot even knock on the door anymore. I started to notice that the change in Daniel had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, almost careful, like someone slowly dimming a light, so you would not realize how dark the room had become until it was already too late. In the beginning, he still came by on Sundays, still sat at my kitchen table and asked about my week. But even then his phone was always within reach, lighting up with messages he would glance at and quickly turn over, as if he did not want me to see. Ashley rarely came with him at first, always having a reason, a work commitment, a headache, something that sounded reasonable enough that I never questioned it. But over time, even Daniel's visits became shorter, more rushed, as if he had somewhere more important to be. I remember one afternoon when he stood in the doorway, car keys already in his hand, saying he could only stay for 15 minutes because they had dinner plans, and I nodded and smiled like it was perfectly normal, even though I had spent the entire morning preparing his favorite meal. The food sat untouched on the table after he left, and I wrapped it up carefully, telling myself I would eat it later, but I never did. There were other moments too, small ones that seemed insignificant on their own, but formed a pattern when placed side by side. Like the time I found out about a family barbecue through a neighbor who had seen photos online, or when Christmas dinner was suddenly moved to Ashley's parents' house, without anyone mentioning it to me, until after the day had passed. Each time, there was an explanation, always polite, always reasonable, but there was something underneath it, something unspoken that made me feel like I was being managed rather than included. Ashley had a way of speaking that sounded kind on the surface, but left no room for argument, a tone that suggested decisions had already been made long before I was ever considered. I told myself this was just how families changed, that sons grew up and built their own lives, that I needed to step back and give them space. But deep down I could feel that it was not just distance, it was removal, slow and deliberate. And when I finally looked at my phone and saw that even the last thread of connection had been cut without a word, I realized that all those small moments had been leading to this, not by accident, but by design. The moment I understood that it was not confusion or distance, but something far more intentional came quietly, without any confrontation or raised voices, just a series of small confirmations that fit together too perfectly to ignore. I tried once more to reach Daniel, dialing his number from memory instead of relying on my contact list, hoping that perhaps something had been misconfigured on my phone, but the call ended the same way, straight to voicemail. Not even a ring, not even the illusion of connection. I set the phone down carefully on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long moment, staring at it as if it might offer an explanation, but it remained silent, just like everything else. That was when I realized this had not been done in a moment of anger. It had been planned, executed cleanly, without leaving room for questions or second chances. I thought about Ashley then, about the way she had always maintained a certain control over the atmosphere whenever I was around, how conversations seemed to shift depending on her mood, how Daniel would glance at her before answering even the simplest questions, as if seeking approval witut realizing it. It was not loud or obvious, not something you could point to and call out in the moment, but it was there, steady and consistent, shaping the space until there was no room left for me. I walked through the house that afternoon, past the living room, where family photos still lined the shelves, pictures of birthdays, holidays, moments that now felt distant and carefully edited, and I noticed something I had overlooked before, that in the most recent photos, I was no longer there. At first, I had assumed it was coincidence, timing, but now it looked different, deliberate, like someone had been slowly removing me from the story one image at a time. I stopped in front of the hallway mirror and looked at myself, really looked, and for the first time, I did not see someone forgotten. I saw someone who had been intentionally set aside. The difference mattered more than I expected, because being forgotten suggests carelessness, but being removed requires decision. And once I allowed myself to accept that, something inside me shifted, not into anger, not even into sadness, but into a kind of clarity that made everything that followed feel less like a loss and more like the beginning of understanding. 2 days after I came to that realization, I stopped trying to reach them all together, not because I had given up, but because there was nothing left to reach, and for the first time in a long while, my days felt strangely uninterrupted, as if the quiet had settled into something steady instead of something empty. That Friday afternoon, I drove to the small convenience store just a few miles from my house, the same one I had been visiting for years, where the cashier knew my name and always asked about my garden in the spring. I picked up a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and almost as an afterthought, I bought a lottery ticket, something I had done occasionally over the years, never expecting anything more than the small, momentary distraction it provided. It was not hope that made me buy it, just habit, just something to fill the space between one quiet day and the next. I remember placing the ticket on the kitchen counter when I got home, right next to the mail, and not thinking about it again for the rest of the evening. The house was calm that night, the kind of calm that comes when there is no one left to interrupt your thoughts, and I went through my usual routine without any sense that anything was about to change. It was not until the following morning, with a cup of coffee in my hand and the morning light coming through the window, that I noticed the ticket again. I almost threw it away without checking it, assuming it would be like all the others, but something made me pause, just long enough to take out my reading glasses and compare the numbers carefully, one by one. At first, it did not register. The sequence seemed familiar but distant, like something I had seen before without paying attention, and then I checked again, slower this time, matching each number deliberately, and that was when I felt it, not excitement, not joy, but a quiet shift in the air around me. I set the ticket down, picked it up again, and checked it a third time, because certainty does not come easily when something feels too large to belong to you. $50 million. The number did not feel real. It felt like something meant for someone else, someone with a different life, a different story, and yet there it was, sitting on my kitchen counter in a house that had never felt more silent. I did not call anyone. There was no one to call, and even if there had been, I would not have known what to say, so I simply stood there, holding that small piece of paper, realizing that while everything around me had remained the same, something fundamental had just shifted, something that would change not only how the world saw me, but how certain people would suddenly remember that I existed. For a long time, I simply stood there in that quiet kitchen, holding the ticket as if it might disappear if I moved too quickly, and then I placed it carefully back on the counter and sat down, not to celebrate, but to think, because something about the moment did not feel like luck, it felt like clarity. The house looked exactly the same as it had the day before, the same walls, the same photographs, the same silence, and yet everything had shifted in a way that did not need to be announced out loud. I did not rush to call the lottery office. I did not turn on the television. I did not even allow myself to imagine what $50 million could buy, because my mind was not on the money, it was on the timing. 2 weeks after being completely cut off, after being erased without explanation, something had landed in my hands that would suddenly make me visible again, and I understood, with a calmness that surprised me, that how I handled this would matter far more than what the number itself represented. I made myself another cup of coffee, sat at the table, and began to list the things I needed to do, not out of excitement, but out of necessity, because I had lived long enough to know that sudden change requires careful steps. The first call I made was not to anyone I knew, but to a financial advisor recommended by my bank years ago, someone who did not have a personal connection to me or my family, someone who would see this situation clearly without emotion. I scheduled an appointment for the following Monday and said very little beyond what was necessary, because even speaking about it out loud felt like something that needed to be controlled. Over the next few days, I kept everything the same on the surface. I went to the store, I watered the garden, I nodded politely to neighbors who passed by, and if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed that I was not distracted or overwhelmed. I was focused. I gathered documents, reviewed old accounts, and quietly began putting structures in place that would protect what I now held, not from strangers, but from the kind of attention that comes when people suddenly remember your value. I did not try to reach Daniel, and I did not expect to hear from him, because as far as they knew, nothing had changed, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as I needed. There is a difference between reacting to a situation and preparing for what comes next, and for the first time in a very long time, I was not reacting to anything. I was deciding, step by step, what the next chapter of my life would look like, and who, if anyone, would be allowed to be part of it. The news did not come from me, and that was exactly how I wanted it, because information has a way of traveling faster when you are not the one pushing it, and within a few days, something subtle began to shift in the way people looked at me, in the way conversations paused just a second longer than usual, in the way my name seemed to carry a different weight when it was spoken. I noticed it first at the bank when I returned for a follow-up meeting. The receptionist who had barely looked up the week before now greeted me with a careful politeness, as if she had been told something important but was trying not to show it too openly. Then it happened at the grocery store. A neighbor who had not spoken to me in months suddenly asked how I had been, her tone warmer than I remembered. Her smile held just a little longer than necessary. None of it was direct. No one mentioned numbers or tickets or winnings. But I could feel the change, quiet but unmistakable, like a current moving just beneath the surface. I did not react to it. I did not confirm anything, because I understood that once something is spoken out loud, it cannot be taken back, and I was not ready for that yet. It was late that evening when my phone lit up for the first time in weeks with a number I recognized immediately. Daniel's name appearing on the screen as if nothing had ever happened, as if the silence between us had been nothing more than a brief interruption. I let it ring. I watched it until it stopped, not out of anger, but because I needed to see it for what it was, not a call from a son who missed his mother, but a reaction to something he had just learned. A few minutes later, another call came in, this time followed by a message, simple and carefully worded, asking if I was doing well, saying he had been meaning to check in, the kind of message that pretends time has not passed when it clearly has. I set the phone down without responding and returned to my seat. The room, just as quiet as before, but now the silence felt different, not empty, not heavy, but controlled. I knew what would come next because patterns do not change. They only adjust to new circumstances, and for the first time, I was not the one trying to understand them. I was the one watching them unfold. The next morning, I did not rush to return Daniel's call, and I did not open his message again, because there was nothing in it that required immediate attention, and for the first time, I allowed time to work in my favor instead of against me. By midday, another message appeared, this one longer, more detailed, mentioning how busy things had been, how life had gotten complicated, how he had been meaning to reach out sooner, each sentence carefully arranged to sound reasonable without ever addressing the silence directly. I read it once, then set the phone aside, noticing how familiar the pattern felt, not in the words themselves, but in the way responsibility was gently redirected, softened, made to seem like circumstance rather than choice. It was not long before Ashley's name appeared on my screen as well, not through a call at first, but through a message that began with a tone I had not heard from her in a long time, warm, almost affectionate, asking how I had been, saying she hoped we could reconnect, as if the distance between us had been mutual instead of one-sided. I sat in my living room with the phone resting in my hand, the same room where I had once waited for invitations that never came, and I let the moment settle without reacting to it. A second message followed shortly after, this time suggesting that we meet for coffee, something casual, something easy, a setting where difficult conversations could be avoided or reshaped into something more convenient. I could almost hear the carefulness behind it, the intention to approach slowly, to rebuild access without confronting what had been done. I did not feel anger as I read her words, and I did not feel satisfaction either. Only a steady awareness that everything unfolding now was exactly what I had expected once the balance had shifted. Later that afternoon, Daniel called again, and this time I answered, not because I felt ready to reconnect, but because I wanted to hear the difference for myself. His voice carried a familiarity that would have been comforting once, but now it sounded measured, cautious, as if he were trying to find the right tone rather than speaking naturally. He asked how I had been, whether I needed anything, whether we could get together soon. Each question layered with a kind of politeness that had not been there before. I responded simply, without offering more than necessary, allowing pauses to exist without filling them, and in those pauses, I could feel the shift more clearly than in any words he spoke. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat quietly for a moment, not reflecting on what had been said, but on what had not, because no apology had been offered, no acknowledgement of the silence, only a careful attempt to move forward as if nothing had changed, and that, more than anything else, told me exactly how I needed to respond next. 2 days later, I agreed to meet them, not because I was ready to rebuild anything, but because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go without ever saying what needed to be said. We chose a small cafe just outside the city, quiet enough for conversation, but public enough to keep everything measured, and when I arrived, they were already there, sitting side by side as if nothing had ever been broken between us. Ashley stood first, her smile warm, her voice gentle as she greeted me, and Daniel followed, his expression softer than I had seen in a long time. But there was something beneath it, something cautious, something waiting. I took my seat across from them and placed my hands calmly on the table, not rushing to speak, allowing the silence to settle just long enough for them to feel it. They asked about my health, my days, whether I had been keeping busy, questions that sounded thoughtful but never touched the space that had existed between us for weeks. I answered simply, without offering more than necessary, watching how each response seemed to guide them, how they adjusted their tone, their posture, their words, as if trying to find the version of me that would respond the way they expected. Ashley mentioned how much they had missed seeing me, how things had been hectic, how they wanted to spend more time together again, and I listened without interrupting, because what mattered was not what she said, but what she avoided. There was no mention of the silence, no acknowledgement of the distance, only a careful attempt to move forward as if the past could be quietly replaced with something more convenient. When the conversation slowed, I reached into my bag and placed a simple folder on the table, not opening it, just letting it rest there between us, and for the first time, both of them fell completely silent. I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse. I simply looked at them and spoke clearly, telling them that I had spent the past weeks understanding what had happened, not through words, but through actions, and that I had also spent that